Hey, welcome back to the fourth video of the virtual sponsorship series. In today's video, we're going to pick up right where we left off in page 8 of Bill's story. If you haven't seen those videos, go ahead and check those out now. I would also like to take a second to thank everybody who has encouraged me and supported me in this process of making this video series. I am slowly but surely acquiring a bunch of equipment to make the production value of this series and this channel much better for you guys. Near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. My musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. He was sober. It was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. I wondered how he had escaped. Of course he would have dinner, and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing. An oasis. Drinkers are like that. So over the years, this paragraph has really jumped out and grabbed my attention. What I realized was, as he's sitting in the kitchen, musing about how much booze he has, his musing is interrupted by a telephone call. And what I realized is this telephone call had what I like to view as divine timing. In the last video, we went over how he finally had that step one moment where quicksand stretched around him in all directions. He had met his match. He had been overwhelmed. Alcohol was his master. And if this telephone call came before he had that step one moment, he probably never would have heard the guy out. And if this telephone call had come a few months later, there's a very, very strong possibility that Bill would have been dead. But it's almost like as soon as his mind was ready to learn, the teacher appeared. And if it wasn't for this divine timing, Bill would never have gotten sober, AA would never have become a thing, and we would not be having this discussion right now. The door opened, and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it. Disappointed, but curious, I wondered what had got into the fellow. He wasn't himself. So Bill gets the phone call and his old friend Ebby Thatcher shows up. And Ebby Thatcher, Bill knew for sure, drank like he did. And right away, Bill can tell that something is different about him. It's in his eyes, he mentions. And you hear that in AA all the time. They say the light came back on in their eyes. And it's a very powerful message. You know, as alcoholics, we have a long history of lying. And so for the first time in our lives, we start to make real and actual change. And when we try to tell people about it, they sort of roll their eyes because we're not credible. So this light that comes on in the eyes, this change in our appearance is often a more powerful message than anything we might be able to say to somebody. I know that in my life, my parents were prepared to give me this entire speech on all the rules that they were going to put on me when I came to visit them. thinking that thee had to try to help me manage my drinking. And the minute I stepped off the plane and thee saw the outward appearance had been altered and the light was back on in my eyes, thee threw the speech out the window and realized that they weren't dealing with the same mess that I used to be. "Come, what's all this about?" I queried. He looked straight at me. Simply, but smilingly, he said, "I've got religion." I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now, I suspected, a little cracked about a religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire all right, but bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching. I love how it says he was aghast, right? He was horrified. I had the same reaction when I first came into AA and he started throwing the God word around. It had reminded me of my childhood where I was forced to go to a Catholic school, which I separated from as soon as I was old enough. And the minute I heard about this solution that I so desperately needed at the time, my mind immediately just snapped shut, just like Bill's. But he did no ranting. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea and a practical program of action. That was 2 months ago, and the result was self-evident. It worked. He had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. I was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. So Ebby's referring to the Oxford group here. He was at court and two members from the Oxford group show up and, take him from court and basically get him sober. Now, the Oxford group was a spiritual-based program that had quite some success at helping people get sober before AA ever existed. However, the Oxford group was a Christian-based program, and therefore it was exclusive to people who were okay with accepting Christianity as their faith, and that excluded a lot of people. Not only people of other religious faiths, but also the people that are very close-minded to religion. Similar to AA, they did have a group of principles that they followed that kind of mimic the step work in AA. However, the Oxford group did not have anything resembling the traditions of AA, and because of that, eventually the group itself started to crumble and fell apart. He talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays, way over there on the hillside. There was that pro-offered Temperance Pledge I never signed. My grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folk and their doings, his insistence that the spheres really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. So as I was doing my research to make this video, I actually learned quite a bit from this paragraph. So he talks about the pro-offered Temperance Pledge that he never signed. And it's a Temperance Pledge is a promise to God to abstain from alcohol. And I had never realized how ironic that statement was. That had always gone over my head. And then the spheres really had their music. Back in, I think it was the 6th century AD, some of the astronomers realized that the planets in the solar system were arranged where if they had coinciding frequencies, they would create a harmony. And they thought that they might actually make music that human beings were just unable to hear. Now, whether or not that theory is true, basically what his grandfather meant when he said that is there is a beauty and a meaning behind the universe. And he denies that his preacher's right in telling him how he must view these things. But really what's happening here is instead of his mind snapping shut, like in the last paragraph when he said he was aghast, this guy's cracked on religion, he's actually opening his mind for the very first time and just kind of considering what faith and religion and spirituality mean to him. And he starts this process by thinking back to his childhood. And the minute his mind is open just a little bit, something just slips in there. This Winchester Cathedral just pops into his head. Now, in the last video, I said we were going to make a mental note about the Winchester Cathedral because it was going to come up later. And so here it is again. And if you guys don't remember, the Winchester Cathedral was at the very beginning of his story when he was overseas in Europe during World War I. And there was a doggerel on an old tombstone. And we'll get back to this in a few paragraphs here. I had always believed in a power greater than myself. I had often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are, for that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay it all. How could there be so much precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in a spirit of the universe who knew neither time nor limitation, but that was as far as I had gone. And so he gets closer to this pay dirt here. Now, not only is he thinking about his childhood, but now he's thinking about what this idea of a higher power means to him right now here in this present moment. And although he feels at this point that that's insufficient, at least he's considering it. With ministers and the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated, and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. To Christ I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him. His moral teaching most excellent. For myself, I had adopted those parts which seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. So after considering for the first time what these spiritual ideas mean to him, he remembers all the negative stuff, all his former prejudice, and his mind starts to kind of close again, and doubt comes up, which is like a perfectly logical sequence of events as he has this argument in his head as he's listening to Ebby talk. The wars which had been fought, the burnings and chinchery that religious dispute had facilitated made me sick. I honestly doubted whether, on balance, the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging from what I had seen in Europe and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible, the brotherhood of man a grim jest. If there was a devil, he seemed the boss universal, and he certainly had me. And right here is an argument that I hear all the time when sponsoring people. And it's a perfectly reasonable argument. However, the bad actions of a few should not outweigh the benefit that millions of people receive from having faith. But in this moment, Bill's mind almost completely snaps back shut at the idea of it all. But my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed, doctors had pronounced him incurable, society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he admitted complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead. suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute, and this was none at all. So the saving grace here, what stops his mind from shutting completely to this idea, is the example, the living example of Ebby Thatcher. And this is a very powerful idea, right? Because in AA, we're tasked with carrying the message to the alcoholic who still suffers. And the beauty of this is we are the message. Nobody can carry this message unless they have lived it, because we are the only people that understand what it was like. And more powerful still is Bill knew him on a personal level when he was drinking. And so he could see clearly that what he was saying was true because he was different. It was hard for me to believe the message that these people were carrying in the beginning because they were strangers to me. I had no basis of comparison. And so I was always able to kind of compare my way right out of the room. But then eventually what had happened was some of the people that I had drank with and some of the people that I knew were just as messed up as I was started to get sober. And that's when I started to realize there is something miraculous going on here. That floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. Here was something at work in a human heart which had done the impossible. My ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. So once again, he's realizing that Ebby's experience and the change that had come over him was a bit of evidence that this miracle had actually taken place. For he was not just a better version of his old self. He was a new person completely in Bill's eyes. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind or spirit, or nature, but I resisted the thought of Tsar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. So as Bill's going back and forth in his head here, flirting with the idea of God and then having his doubts, and back and forth he goes, he's getting so close to accepting this. And then at the last minute, he's like, nah. And at this point, Ebby has been trying to convert him for hours. And something you have to keep in mind, he's trying to convert him into Christianity. He's not leaving it open-ended. And so that's why Bill is kind of stuck. You know, he's getting down to semantics here. He's completely fine with the idea of intelligence behind it all, but he can't accept this idea of a Christian God here. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, "Why don't you choose your own conception of God?" That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. So, Ebby's got Bill on the hook. He's working him. He's getting so close. And then at the last minute, Bill, still being stubborn, says, nah. And Ebby, I think, gets a little frustrated here. And so when he throws this idea out at him that why don't you choose your own conception of God, he did it in a sarcastic way. He was frustrated, and he didn't necessarily mean that in a serious way, because it was kind of like, you look at you're a drunk and you're on your way out the door, and you're so smart, why don't you choose your own conception of God? But this is the cataclysm that starts it all. And as he so beautifully put, the statement hits him hard, and it melts the icy shadow of the mountain, and he's in the sunlight at last. He finally makes it over to the other side, and he finally opens his mind fully to this idea. As soon as he's given the freedom to kind of find his own way and not accept a preconceived notion of a God. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. So here is his step 2 moment. He had his step 1 moment in the last video we did, and now he is coming to believe that there is there's hope for him. He was resigned to die by a death from alcohol, and for the first time he realizes like there might be a solution from him. And so it's this willingness to believe that is necessary to make the journey, but that's it. You don't need to have the faith from the get-go. A matter of fact, if faith was a requirement to start the journey, not too many people would make it. But if you can be willing to believe, then it makes it much easier to take that first step. And so just opening his mind that much, the door was opened and he could walk through it at last. And with this willingness to believe, he could build a firm foundation by working the rest of the steps to have a faith that works for recovery. Thus was I convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. The real significance of my experience in the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself, and so it had been ever since. How blind I had been. Oftentimes in AA you hear people talk about a psychic change. And so Bill has a psychic change here right after his step 2 moment. The scales of pride and prejudice fall from his eyes and a new world comes into view. So his perception is drastically changed in this moment. And then in the first moments of this new perception, the real significance from his experience at the Winchester Cathedral bursts forth upon him. And so what he realized is in this moment, when he looks back into his youth when he was in Europe during World War I, he sees this tombstone at the Winchester Cathedral, and it was the ominous warning he failed to heed because the soldier had drank himself to death. And what he realizes is that God had always been there. And I think most people in recovery have that moment where they realize that God has been there all along and we were just too blind to realize it. But he was still protecting us, and that he has led us exactly to this moment, and this moment is exactly where we are supposed to be. As powerful as this experience is, this new world that comes into view as a result of it is fleeting. And sooner than later, this light is blotted out and he can no longer feel the presence of God. And he says it's because of worldly clamors, fear, resentment, all this stuff brewing around inside of him blocks him from feeling the presence of God. And so more work must be done. This significant experience he had, this spiritual experience, is the catalyst that changes it all, but without maintenance, it's only fleeting. At the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. There I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. I ruthlessly faced my sins and became willing to have my newfound friend take them away root and branch. I have not had a drink since. So Bill goes back to rehab with Dr. Silkworth for the third time. And there he starts to do what eventually became the 12 steps. Keep in mind, AA has not been created yet, so there is no 12 steps. However, we are going to clearly see what Bill does, and we're going to identify where all the steps are. So he already did his 1 and his 2 when he was out there drinking. So he gets separated from alcohol, and there he does his 3rd step. He humbly offers himself to God. From there, he ruthlessly faces his sins. He does a 4th step. He writes an inventory while he's in treatment. And then he also becomes willing to have God remove these defects that caused all this negative stuff to happen in his 4th step. He's willing for God to remove them root and branch. So in other words, he also does step 6 and step 7 while he's in there. My schoolmate visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. We made a list of people I had hurt or toward whom I felt resentment. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals, admitting my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to right all such matters to the utmost of my ability. So Ebby Thatcher comes to the rehab and visits Bill. While there, Bill does a 5th step with him and reads off his inventory to him. Then from there, he tackles step 8 and 9. He becomes willing to make these amends, and then they discuss the tact that he must use when he goes forth to make these amends. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. Then only might I expect to receive, but that would be in great measure. So here you got step 10, he sits quietly when he's in doubt, like he continues to take inventory, and when he's wrong, he promptly admits it. And also step 11, in step 11, it says praying only for the knowledge of his will and the power to carry it out. And it says it right there. Never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. My friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my Creator, that I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems. Belief in the power of God plus enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain the new order of things were the essential requirements. Simple, but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of Light who presides over us all. So Ebby tells him that once he does all these things, he will enter into a new relationship with his creator. And so that's the first part of step 12. Having done these steps, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. But I really want to talk about this price that must be paid. This self-centeredness. This is much more challenging than you might think. You see, when we come in, we are self-centered, and because of this, we view the world as if it revolves around us. It's a self-centered universe, a self-centered world. And see, the problem with this is we've probably had this mind state for most of our lives. And so everything that we've learned, everything that we've experienced, everything that we perceived is through this mind state, at being the center of everything. And so if we are to accept that we are not the center and God is the center, all of the sudden we have to reevaluate everything we know. Because if God is the center and we're not, then we probably have a ton of ideas that are no longer going to work. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. So Bill is describing here what it's like to have a spiritual experience as a result of these steps. And Bill has what the AA members call a white light experience. So the presence, the conscious existence and the presence of God rushes upon him all at once and gives him this like very intense experience. And not everybody's experience in AA is going to reflect that. We also have what they call the educational variety. However, even if you have the educational variety of this spiritual experience, there usually is an aha moment. It just usually ends up happening much further along down the line. Like they say in the AA promises, we suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we can not do for ourselves. For a moment I was alarmed and called my friend the doctor to ask if I were still sane. He listened in wonder as I talked. Finally he shook his head, saying, "Something has happened to you I don't understand, but you had better hang on to it. Anything is better than the way you were." The good doctor now sees many men who have such experiences. He knows that they are real. While I lay in the hospital, the thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who'd be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. Thee in turn might work with others. So Bill actually has such a strong experience that he actually thinks he's going crazy here. I remember at one point having an experience very similar to this, and I was just overwhelmed by the perfection and the beauty of the world for a fleeting moment, and it shook me. I felt like I was shaking on the inside, and I was crying. I was so moved. And I remember seeing some close friends that were also in recovery, and I did my best to explain to them what I was experiencing, and they, having more experience than me at the time, said that it sounded like a spiritual experience. So I could relate to Bill on feeling like I was losing my mind. And then he gets to the bulk of step 12 here, sharing this message with the alcoholic who still suffers, right? Helping the next sorry person that's just as desperate as we are. My friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. Particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Faith without works was dead, he said, and how appallingly true for the alcoholic. If an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. If he did not work, he would surely drink again, and if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead indeed. With us, it is just like that. So this paragraph starts off with the last part of the step 12, and practice these principles in all of our affairs. And then it goes on to talk about this work with other alcoholics, sponsorship as we call it today. And it says, and it promises, that there are low spots coming, right? The storm is coming. And if you are not prepared for the storm when it hits, we die. And to sit there when things are good and the sun is shining and think a storm is not coming, that's a fool's paradise. And so this work with other alcoholics is so necessary, because when all else fails, work with an alcoholic will save the day. So when we're out to sea and storm, and we can't find our way back to the path that works, sponsorship is the beacon that will bring us back. My wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics to a solution of their problems. I was fortunate, for my old business associates remained skeptical for a year and a half, during which I found little work. I was not too well at the time and was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. This sometimes nearly drove me back to drink, but I soon found that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. Many times I have gone to my old hospital in despair. On talking to a man there, I would be amazingly lifted up and set on my feet. It is a design for living that works in rough going. So this is really a testament to the difficulties of early sobriety. Anybody who has experience with it understands this emotional roller coaster that we go through. And so Bill is plagued with waves of self-pity and resentment as his emotional state is in turmoil in his first year and a half, and his financial difficulties. The first year or so in sobriety is very difficult for some people, and the best way that we can make it through it is by being of service to other people. We commenced to make many fast friends, and a fellowship has grown up among us of which it is a wonderful thing to feel a part. The joy of living we really have, even under pressure and difficulty. I have seen hundreds of families set their feet in a path that really goes somewhere. Have seen the most impossible domestic situations righted, feuds and bitterness of all sorts wiped out. I have seen men come out of asylums and resume a vital place in the lives of their families and communities. Business and professional men have regained their standing. There is scarcely any form of trouble and misery which has not been overcome among us. In one western city and its environs, there are 1,000 of us in our families. We meet frequently so that the newcomers may find the fellowship they seek. At these informal gatherings, one may often see from 50 to 200 persons. We are growing in numbers and power. So as rewarding as the 12-step work can be, with this new psychic change and the new world that comes into view as a result of it, just as rewarding as that is the fellowship itself. The longer you're a member and the closer you get with the people, the more you enjoy the life it has given you. They say you only have to go to meetings until you want to. And then at the end, there's this asterisk here. that says there's 50 to 200 persons at the meeting, and their membership is about 1,000. So I looked at the latest numbers, and their best estimate as of 2020 is just over 2 million members of Alcoholics Anonymous and over 129,000 active groups. So it has really grown over the years. An alcoholic in his cups is an unlovely creature. Our struggles with them are variously strenuous, comic, and tragic. One poor chap committed suicide in my home. He could not or would not see our way of life. There is, however, a vast amount of fun about it all. I suppose some would be shocked at our seeming worldliness and levity, but just underneath there is deadly earnestness. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us, or we perish. Most of us feel we need look no further for utopia. We have it with us right here and now. Each day, my friend's simple talk in our kitchen multiplies itself in a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. And this rings true to me. There is a lot of fun and laughter in AA, but just underneath there is a deadly seriousness to it all. Because alcohol, which kills us all the time, is the thing that binds us all together. We come from all wakes of life. And it says faith must work 24 hours a day through us or we perish. And thank God for that, because there's no way that I could have faith 24/7, because sometimes I struggle. But this is the beauty of the fellowship. When one person is sick, the others can lift them up. And so we have found our utopia in AA. Well, that concludes Bill's story. Next video, we will get into Chapter 2, There is a Solution. I hope that some of you guys have learned as much as I have making these videos. And as always, I've had a blast making them. Feel free to comment any suggestions or for content, or how we could increase the production value of this, and like and subscribe. Until next time, God bless.